Imagine standing in your kitchen for a moment. You reach for a small glass shaker, and with a casual flick of your wrist, you shower your meal in a fine white powder. It is one of the cheapest, most common substances on the planet. We treat it as an afterthought. We buy it for pennies and consume it in quantities that would have seemed like an impossible fantasy to our ancestors. But for the vast majority of human history, that white powder was not just a condiment, it was white gold. It was a substance so precious that empires were built on its trade, wars were fought over its possession, and thousands of people were driven into the dark, suffocating depths of the earth to harvest it at the cost of their own lives. In the ancient world, salt was not a luxury. It was the bedrock of survival. And to get it, humanity created what was arguably the most dangerous job ever conceived. To understand why people would risk everything for salt, you have to look past the taste. Before the invention of electric refrigeration, salt was the only thing standing between a civilization and mass starvation. It was the primary method of food preservation. If you wanted to cure moult to last through a harsh winter, you needed salt. If you were a sailor crossing the Mediterranean or a soldier marching across the plains of Gaul, your rations of fish and pork were kept edible only through the power of salt. Without it, protein became a poison within days. This necessity meant that salt production became the world's first massive state-sponsored industrial undertaking. But nature does not often leave pure salt lying on the surface for the taking. While some could be gathered from the edges of the sea or from drying pools, the purest and most concentrated deposits were locked deep underground, trapped in ancient geological layers that had been buried for millions of years. Reaching that salt required a workforce that was considered entirely expendable. If you lived in the Roman Empire and found yourself on the wrong side of the law, there was one sentence that was feared above almost all others. It was called Damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines. In the legal hierarchy of Rome, this was not just labor, it was a slow, calculated execution. It was the punishment reserved for the most serious offenders, the political dissidents, and the lowest class of slaves. To be sent to the salt mines was to be erased from the world of the living. A prisoner sentenced to the mines lost their property, their legal rights, and their very status as a human being. They were often shackled in heavy iron chains, linked to one another in long lines, and driven into unventilated tunnels where the sun would never reach them again. For these individuals, the mine was not a workplace, it was a tomb they were forced to dig for themselves.
The environment inside an ancient salt mine was a strange paradox of preservation and destruction. Salt is a naturally sterile environment. Because it is so efficient at killing bacteria, it actually prevents decay. This is why salt was so valuable for meat, and it is also why it has accidentally preserved history in ways that no other environment can. But while the salt preserved the materials of the dead, it was incredibly efficient at killing the living. Salt is hygroscopic, meaning it greedily absorbs water from anything it touches. For a miner, this was a constant physical assault on their biology. Every breath they took pulled fine, crystalline salt dust into their lungs. Once inside, that dust immediately began to suck the moisture out of the mucous membranes of the throat and the respiratory system.
Imagine the sensation of your throat and lungs being perpetually parched, no matter how much water you drank. The miners suffered from chronic, agonizing dehydration. Their skin, constantly rubbed by salt crystals and soaked in the sweat of their labor, would crack and bleed. These wounds would then be irritated further by the salt dust, creating a stinging pain that never relented. But perhaps the most terrifying hazard was the effect on the eyes. The constant exposure to salt dust caused severe inflammation and scarring. Over the years, many of those sentenced to the mines suffered from permanent vision loss. They lived their final days in a world of total darkness, navigating the tunnels by the sound of the picks and the rhythmic clanking of their chains.
Even the air they breathed was a threat. To provide light, the state provided small clay oil lamps or torches made of resinous wood. In the tight, airless corridors of a salt mine, the soot from these lamps mixed with the salt dust to create a thick, suffocating fog. In many cases, the miners were forced to use a technique called fire setting to break through the harder rock faces. They would build massive fires directly against the salt face, stoking the flames until the rock reached a blistering temperature. Then, they would suddenly throw cold water against the heated surface. The thermal shock would cause the salt to crack and shatter, but the side effect was a tunnel filled with toxic smoke and scalding steam. In a world without mechanical ventilation, the miners had to endure this atmosphere for 14 or 16 hours a day, their lungs burning with every gasp.
Despite the horror of the Roman mines, the history of salt extraction goes back much further than the empire of the Caesars, and it wasn't always a place of punishment. In the high altitudes of the Austrian Alps, at a place called Hallstatt, we find the world's oldest salt mine. Evidence shows that humans were extracting salt here as early as 6000 BCE, originally by boiling spring water. But by the early Iron Age, between 800 and 400 BCE, the Hallstatt culture had built an entire economic power on salt mining. And here, we see a fascinating contrast to the Roman model. Archaeological evidence suggests that these Iron Age miners might not have been slaves at all, but rather a specialized and perhaps even elite class of laborers. The excavations at Hallstatt have revealed a society that was remarkably wealthy for its time. The miners there were well-fed and wore high-quality textiles. They used sophisticated bronze picks and wooden shovels, and they developed specialized leather backpacks to haul the salt up from the depths of the mountain. The logistics were staggering. They had to move massive quantities of salt down steep mountain paths to reach the trade networks of Europe. Because salt is so sterile, it has preserved the evidence of their lives in incredible detail. In 1734, modern miners in Hallstatt made a discovery that seems like something out of a ghost story. They found a body perfectly preserved in the salt, wearing wool clothing and leather shoes that were still intact after more than 2,000 years. This man in salt, believed to have died in a mine collapse around 350 BCE, serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers inherent in the job. Even for a well-fed and high-status miner, the mountain was always hungry.
This value of salt as a strategic resource meant that it was almost always a tool of the state. In the year 110 BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty in China realized that salt could be more than just a mineral. It could be a weapon of economic control. He established a state monopoly on salt, seizing control of production and distribution. The profits from this monopoly were used to fund the empire's massive military campaigns and to expand the borders of China. It was a pattern that would be repeated across the globe. In Rome, one of the oldest and most vital roads in the entire peninsula was the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It ran from the coastal salt works at Ostia through the heart of the city and deep into the interior. Control of the Via Salaria was control of the Roman economy.
This connection between salt and wealth is even woven into the language we speak today. The word salary comes from the Latin word salarium. There is a popular historical anecdote that Roman soldiers were paid directly in bags of salt, but most modern historians believe this is a slight misunderstanding. It is far more likely that soldiers were given a salt allowance, a specific sum of money designated for the purchase of salt. It shows just how necessary the mineral was. It was the one thing you absolutely had to have, regardless of your rank or location. To be worth one salt was to be worth the cost of keeping you functional and fed.
As the demand grew, the mines became deeper and more complex. In Pakistan, the Khavra salt mine stands as a monument to the ancient world's ambition. Legend states it was discovered in 326 BCE during the Indian campaign of Alexander the Great. According to the story, Alexander's army was resting near the mountains when the soldiers noticed their horses licking the rocks. When the men investigated, they found the rocks were made of salt. While some historians view the horse story as more of a legend than a documented fact, the mine itself became the second largest in the world, a massive underground labyrinth that has been worked for millennia.
In Egypt, the search for salt led workers to the Siwa oasis. There, they mined rock salt and natron, a specific type of salt used in the mummification process. Without the dangerous labor of the salt miners, the great pharaohs of Egypt could never have achieved their quest for physical immortality. Every mummy preserved in a museum today is a reminder of the miners who labored in the heat and dust of the Egyptian desert to harvest the chemicals of the afterlife. Meanwhile, in Poland, the Wieliczka mine was already seeing activity in the Neolithic period, with people evaporating brine to get at the white crystals. These locations were the power plants of the ancient world, providing the energy needed to keep society moving.
But the physical reality for the workers never improved. Because salt is a relatively soft mineral, the mines were prone to a phenomenon known as creeps. This is a terrifyingly slow process where the sheer weight of the rock above causes the salt walls to gradually deform and flow inward.
A tunnel that was perfectly safe when it was carved could, over the course of a few months, begin to narrow and squeeze shut. Miners worked with the constant knowledge that the mountain was slowly trying to reclaim the space they had stolen. Combined with the sudden collapses that were common in poorly braced shafts, the salt mine was a place where death could come either in a sudden roar of falling rock or in the slow, silent pressure of the earth moving inch by inch.
When we look back at these places, from the salt cathedrals of Poland to the Roman shafts in Spain or the mountain mines of Austria, we are looking at the sites of the most grueling labor in human history. The salt miner was the invisible engine of the ancient world. He was the reason the Roman legions could march for thousands of miles. He was the reason a farmer could survive a winter with enough protein to keep his family alive. He was the reason empires could tax their citizens and build monuments that still stand today. And yet, for most of these workers, life was a cycle of darkness, thirst, and pain.
There is a deep irony in the fact that salt, a substance that preserves life and prevents decay, was so often harvested by people who were being physically destroyed by it. The sterile environment that kept the man in salt looking as though he had died yesterday was the same environment that dried the lungs and blinded the eyes of the living. It is a reminder that the comforts we enjoy today, the simple ability to season our food or keep a steak in the fridge, were once the most hard-won luxuries on the planet.
As you look at that salt shaker on your table tonight, think about the scale of the history behind it. Think about the Roman prisoner shackled in the dark, breathing in the soot of an oil lamp and the sting of salt dust. Think about the horses of Alexander the Great licking the stones in Pakistan, and the Iron Age miners of Hallstatt hauling heavy leather bags up the sides of mountains. We live in an age of abundance, where the white gold of the past is now so common we don't even see it. But the story of salt is the story of us. It is the story of our desperation to survive, our ingenuity in engineering, and the dark, dangerous price that was paid to build the foundations of civilization.
The history of the salt mines shows that nothing we have is truly cheap. Everything has a cost, and in the ancient world, that cost was paid in the darkness of the mines. From the state monopolies of the Han Dynasty to the salt roads of Rome, this mineral shaped the world as we know it. It provided the wealth that built cities and the preservation that allowed for the exploration of new lands. It was a substance of life and a substance of death, all at the same time.
If you found this look into the dangerous world of ancient salt mining fascinating, there is so much more to see in the hidden corners of history. We often focus on the kings and the battles, but it is the laborers and the resources that truly drive the narrative of humanity. What other ancient professions do you think were just as hazardous? Are there other common items in your house that you think might have a dark and complex history? We would love to hear your thoughts and your questions in the comments below. If you want to join us for more looks into the stories that built our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode.